Hey, sleepers. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a very special kind of feeling. We are going to whisper about the whispers of plants. Imagine you are standing in a warm, quiet greenhouse. The air is humid and smells of damp earth and green, living things. Sunlight filters down through the glass panes, dappling the leaves around you in soft, shifting patterns of light. You reach out a single finger, slowly, gently, and you touch the tip of a delicate, feathery leaf. Instantly, as if shy, the tiny leaflets fold inward, one after another, and the entire stem droops, playing dead. This is the Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, the touch-me-not. And its quiet, swift reaction is the beginning of our story. A story that asks a very big, very strange question. Can a plant feel? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps our little community grow and ensures you won't miss our future journeys into the quiet corners of science and wonder. And while you're there, we would love to know where you're listening from tonight. Tell us your city or country and what time it is for you. It's a beautiful thought. All of us in different parts of the world, under different skies, settling in to listen to the same quiet story. So, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and get ready to drift off as we explore the scandalous idea of the plant that feels pain. Our journey doesn't begin in a modern laboratory with flashing lights and complex computers. It begins, as so many wonderful stories about the natural world do, in a quiet English garden. Let's drift back in time to the late 19th century. The air is filled with the scent of coal smoke and progress. But in his garden, a gentle, thoughtful man with a magnificent beard is watching the world at a much slower pace. This man is Charles Darwin. Yes, the very same Darwin who gave us the theory of evolution. After he had turned the world of biology upside down, he turned his attention to something much closer to home. He turned his attention to the plants in his garden. He was not alone. He worked alongside his son, Francis. Together, father and son spent years in patient, meticulous observation. They watched tendrils of climbing plants as they sought out support, moving with a grace that seemed almost purposeful. They watched the tips of roots as they navigated the dark, complex world of the soil, avoiding obstacles and seeking out water. They documented the way flowers and leaves would track the sun across the sky, a silent daily dance. In 1880, they gathered all of these observations into a book. They called it The Power of Movement in Plants. It wasn't a scandalous book. It was a book of careful science, but hidden within its pages was a radical idea. Darwin suggested at the tip of a plant's root, the radicle acted like the brain of a lower animal. He saw how it directed the rest of the root's growth, how it sensed its environment, gravity, moisture, obstacles, and made decisions based on that information. He was suggesting a kind of command center, a seat of sensitivity hidden there in the earth. Of course, the scientific community of the day thought he was being a bit too poetic. A brain? In a root? It was a lovely thought, but hardly serious science. They respected Darwin, but this idea was a step too far. And so, for a long time, the idea that plants might have a complex inner life was quietly put back on the shelf, like a fascinating but dusty old book. But the idea did not die. It just traveled. Let's float across the globe now, to early 20th century India. Here, we meet another remarkable scientist, Sir Jagadish Chandra Bose. Bose was a true polymath, a physicist, a biologist, a botanist, an archaeologist, and a writer. He was a pioneer in radio wave technology, but his greatest passion was revealing the hidden world of plants. He believed, with all his heart, that the line between animals and plants was not as sharp as everyone thought. He believed there was a fundamental unity to all life. To prove his point, he needed to give plants a voice. And so he invented one. He created a series of incredibly sensitive instruments. His most famous was the crescograph. This device could magnify the tiniest movements of a plant up to 10 million times. Suddenly, the slow, imperceptible growth of the stem became a visible, flowing line on a smoked glass plate. With the crescograph, Bose could show the world what he saw. He could show a plant physically recoiling when its stem was pinched. He could show it tiring after constant stimulation, and then recovering after a period of rest. Most dramatically, he demonstrated that plants, just like animals, produced a tiny electrical response when they were injured. He would hook up a plant to his sensitive equipment, and when he would prick a leaf, a needle would jump, tracing a spike of electrical activity. It looked remarkably similar to the electrical signal a muscle or nerve produces in an animal. Bose toured Europe with his demonstrations, showing captivated audiences how a cabbage would convulse when dropped into boiling water, as recorded by his instruments. He was showing them, in real time, the plant's reaction to what we would call a profound injury. He argued that this electrical signal was evidence of a shared sensitivity across all life. But again, the scientific establishment was skeptical. They praised his instruments, his ingenuity, but they dismissed his conclusions as philosophy, not science. It was interesting, they said, but it wasn't feeling. It was just mechanics, a complex chemical reaction. Nothing more. And so the idea went back to sleep for a few more decades. It lay dormant, waiting for the world to change. It awoke again in the 1960s, and this time it did so with a bang. This is the part of the story that became a sensation, a pop culture phenomenon. And it all started with a man named Cleve Baxter. Baxter was not a botanist. He was a former CIA interrogation specialist. He was an expert in the polygraph machine, the lie detector. His day job was about measuring the subtle, involuntary physiological responses of humans to emotional questions. One night in 1966, he was working late in his office. He looked over at a Dracaena plant he had, and a whimsical thought crossed his mind. What would happen if he hooked his plant up to the polygraph? It was a strange idea, born of curiosity and boredom. He attached the electrodes to one of the plant's leaves and watered it. He wanted to see if the increased moisture would change the electrical resistance of the leaf. As the water moved up the stem and into the leaf, the polygraph pen began to trace a pattern. But it wasn't what he expected. It didn't look like a simple tracing of water absorption. To his trained eye, it looked familiar. It looked like the pattern of a human subject experiencing a brief, subtle emotional response. Intrigued, Baxter decided to take it a step further. He thought, I need to threaten the plant's well-being. His first thought was to dip a leaf in his hot cup of coffee. But the plant showed no reaction. Then, a more dramatic idea formed in his mind. He would get a match and burn the leaf. The very instant he had this thought, he claimed, before he had moved a muscle, the polygraph needle went wild. It surged upwards, tracing a pattern of intense agitation. Baxter was stunned. It was as if the plant had read his mind. This single event launched a series of informal experiments. He found that his plants seemed to react to the death of brine shrimp in another room. They seemed to show a connection to him, reacting to his emotions even when he was miles away. He published his findings in a paranormal journal, and the idea exploded into the public consciousness. It led to the best-selling book, The Secret Life of Plants, which mixed Baxter's claims with Bose's earlier work and a dose of mysticism. Suddenly, people all over the world were talking to their ferns and playing classical music for their ficuses, believing they were nurturing not just a plant, but a silent, feeling companion. The scientific community, however, was appalled. They pointed out that Baxter's experiments lacked proper controls. His equipment was sensitive to static electricity, humidity changes, and any number of other environmental factors. When other scientists tried to replicate his results under strict laboratory conditions, they failed. The Baxter effect could not be reliably produced. It was dismissed as pseudoscience, a classic case of an experimenter seeing what they wanted to see. And with that, the idea of a feeling plant became a bit of a joke in serious scientific circles. It was tainted by the scandal and the sensationalism. But underneath the noise, something was still there. The quiet observations of Darwin, the electrical signals measured by Bose, they hadn't gone away. And slowly, carefully, a new generation of scientists began to look again. They used new tools, new methods, and a new, more cautious language. In 2006, a group of these scientists proposed a new field of study. They called it plant neurobiology. The name itself was a spark in a tinderbox. Neurobiology is the study of the nervous system. To suggest that plants, which famously lack neurons, nerves, or brains, could have a neurobiology was seen as deeply provocative. The backlash was immediate and fierce. In 2007, a letter signed by 36 prominent plant scientists was published, arguing that the term was misleading and damaging to the credibility of plant science. They argued it was just another form of anthropomorphism, of projecting human qualities onto something non-human. But the scientists who proposed the term stood their ground. They weren't saying that plants have brains. They were saying that plants have a remarkably complex information processing system, a system that uses electrical signals, chemical messengers, and interconnected pathways to sense the world and respond to it in sophisticated ways. They wanted a term that captured this complexity, that encouraged scientists to look at the plant not as a passive, static object, but as an active, dynamic organism, a master of its own, very different kind of life. And with that debate, the modern era of our story begins. The question was no longer a fringe curiosity. It was a serious, if controversial, field of scientific inquiry. The old whispers were finally being listened to with new ears. To truly understand this debate, we need to meet the star of the show, the plant that started it all for so many of us. The Mimosa pudica. Let's return to that quiet, warm greenhouse in our minds. Let's look closely at this little wonder. Its leaves are compound, meaning each leaf stalk is divided into smaller leaflets, which are then divided into even smaller leaflets. They look like delicate green feathers. And at the base of each of these stalks and leaflets, there is a tiny, almost imperceptible swelling, a little joint. This is the key to the whole magic trick. This little joint is called a pulvinus, or pulvini in the plural. You can think of a pulvinus as a tiny hydraulic hinge. It's filled with specialized cells that are very good at holding on to water. When the cells are full of water, they are firm and stiff, like a fully inflated balloon. This stiffness, called turgor pressure, holds the leaf open, angled towards the light. But the pulvinus has a secret ability. It can let go of that water very, very quickly. When you touch the tip of the leaf, a signal travels down the stalk. It's an electrical signal, a whisper of ions moving from cell to cell. When this signal reaches the pulvinus, it's like a command. Release the water. The cell membranes, which were holding the water in, suddenly become permeable. The water rushes out of the cells on one side of the pulvinus, the flexor side. Those cells go from being firm, inflated balloons to being soft, deflated ones. With the support gone, the leaf or leaflet can no longer hold itself up. Gravity takes over and it folds down, elegantly and swiftly. The entire process, from touch to droop, can happen in less than a second. It's one of the fastest movements in the plant kingdom. This folding response has a name. It's called thigmonesty. It's a lovely scientific word. Thigmo comes from the Greek word for touch. Nasty comes from the Greek word for pressure or closing, so it literally means movement caused by touch. It's a defense mechanism. A grazing animal that nibbles the leaf is startled by the sudden movement and the fact that the tasty leaf has suddenly vanished, replaced by a thorny stem. It's a very clever strategy for an organism that can't run away. Stay still, look delicious, but if trouble comes, disappear in an instant. But here is where it gets truly fascinating. Here is where the mimosa plant starts to challenge our definitions. What if the touch isn't a threat? What if it's just a raindrop? Or a gentle, repeated shaking from the wind? It would be a waste of energy for the plant to fold and unfold its leaves all day for no reason. It needs those leaves open to photosynthesize, to make its food from sunlight. A brilliant scientist named Monica Gagliano, an animal ecologist who became fascinated by plants, decided to test this. She is a pioneer in the field, and her work often pushes the boundaries of what we think is possible. She designed an ingenious experiment. She built a device that could drop potted mimosa plants from a short height. The drop wasn't enough to harm them, but it was enough to be a shock, causing their leaves to fold up tightly. She dropped the plants once. As expected, they folded. She waited for them to reopen, and then she dropped them again. They folded again. She did this over and over, 60 times in a row, with a 5-second interval between each drop. And something remarkable began to happen. Around the 4th or 5th drop, the plants started to react less. Their leaves didn't fold as tightly. By the end of the session, many of the plants didn't fold at all. It was as if they had learned that this specific stimulus, this dropping motion, was not a real threat. It was annoying, perhaps, but not dangerous. They had habituated to it. Habituation is a simple form of learning. It's the ability to filter out irrelevant information from the environment. It's something we do all the time. When you first move into a new home near a train track, the sound of the train might startle you every time it passes. But after a few weeks, you barely notice it. Your brain has learned that the sound is not a threat, and it filters it out. These mimosa plants were doing the exact same thing, without a brain, without a single neuron. But Dr. Gagliano's experiment had another, even more startling twist. She took the plants that had learned to ignore the drop, and she left them alone in the quiet greenhouse. She left them for a week. Then she brought them back to the dropping device. She wanted to see if they remembered their lesson. When she dropped them again, they didn't fold. They had retained the information. She tested them again after 2 weeks. They still remembered. She kept testing them. Those little mimosa plants remembered the lesson that the drop was not a threat for up to 40 days. 40 days. This is longer than some insects can remember a similar lesson. This raises a profound question. If you have learning and you have memory, what is it that you are missing? Where is the plant storing this memory? It's not in a brain. It's not in a nervous system. Some scientists suggest the memory might be stored in a chemical form through epigenetic changes, temporary modifications to the DNA that alter how genes are expressed. Others suggest it could be a pattern of calcium ions stored within the cell's vacuoles. The truth is, we don't know for sure. But the fact that we have to ask the question, the fact that a humble little plant can demonstrate behavior that forces us to reconsider the very definition of learning and memory, is what makes this field so exciting. The Mimosa pudica, with its shy, folding leaves, is not just a curiosity. It is a teacher. It is asking us to look deeper, to think more broadly about what it means to be alive and aware of the world. So, how does the mimosa plant send its message? How does the touch on the tip of one leaflet tell the pulvinus at the base of the stem to release its water? The answer is as shocking as it is elegant. It uses electricity, just like we do. When we think of electrical signals in biology, we immediately think of the nervous system. We think of neurons, those long string-like cells that make up our nerves and our brain. A thought, a sensation, a command to move a muscle. It all travels through our body as a wave of electrical charge and action potential. It's incredibly fast. In some of our nerve fibers, these signals can travel over 100 meters per second. That's why you can stub your toe and feel the pain almost instantly. Plants also generate action potentials. They are true action potentials, waves of electrical charge that propagate through their tissues. But there are a few key differences. First, they are slow, very, very slow. Compared to the lightning-fast signals in our nerves, a plant's electrical signal is like a gentle, meandering stream. It travels at a rate of about 1 to 3 millimeters per second. That's why when you touch a mimosa leaf, you can actually watch the wave of folding move down the stem. You are seeing the electrical signal propagate in real time. The second difference is the chemistry behind it. In animals, the action potential is driven primarily by the rapid movement of sodium and potassium ions across the cell membrane. Specialized protein channels open and close, letting the ions rush in and out, creating the electrical wave. Plants don't really use sodium for this. Their system is older, more fundamental. They use calcium, potassium, and chloride ions. They have their own set of ion channels that orchestrate this slower, more deliberate electrical dance. It's a beautiful example of convergent evolution. That's the idea that two completely different organisms, faced with a similar problem, can independently arrive at a similar solution. The problem for both plants and animals was, how do you send a signal quickly over a long distance within your body? Both kingdoms, separated by over 1 billion years of evolution, arrived at the same fundamental answer: use a self-propagating wave of electrical charge. The details are different, the chemistry is tweaked, the speed is not the same, but the principle is identical. It's like two different cultures independently inventing the arch to build strong structures. The shape is the same because the physics are the same. And here is a connection that sends a little shiver down the spine of researchers. What triggers these electrical waves in plants? In many cases, the trigger is a molecule called glutamate. If you know anything about the brain, That name might sound familiar. Glutamate is the most important excitatory neurotransmitter in the animal nervous system. It's the primary go signal in our brains. It's crucial for learning, for memory, for every thought you've ever had. And here it is in plants, playing a strikingly similar role. When a plant is wounded, say, by a caterpillar's bite, the cells at the wound site release a flood of glutamate. This glutamate binds to glutamate receptors on the surface of neighboring cells, and this binding event is what kicks off the electrical wave, the action potential that travels out from the wound, carrying the message. We are under attack. The idea that the very same molecule that powers our thoughts is used by a plant to signal distress is humbling. It hints at a deep, ancient history. It suggests that the communication tools that built our complex brains didn't appear out of nowhere. Their origins are ancient, predating the split between the plant and animal kingdoms. The basic building blocks of awareness, the molecules of communication, were perhaps there from the very beginning. So where do these signals travel? Plants don't have nerves, but they do have a network. They have two main systems for long-distance communication. The first is a series of tiny, microscopic channels called plasmodesmata. You can imagine every plant cell as a little room with walls. The plasmodesmata are like tiny secret tunnels connecting every single room in the house to every other room. These tunnels allow the electrical signal, the wave of ions, to pass directly from cell to cell to cell. It's a slow but very thorough way of spreading the message. The second system is the plant's vascular tissue. These are the veins you see in a leaf. They are the plant's plumbing. They include the xylem, which carries water up from the roots, and the phloem, which carries sugars down from the leaves. This vascular system acts like a superhighway for signals. An electrical wave can get into the phloem and travel much faster and further than it could by going from cell to cell. It's how a signal from a single wounded leaf can reach the entire plant, all the way down to the roots, in a matter of minutes. So let's picture it. A caterpillar takes a bite out of a leaf. At the site of the wound, there is a release of glutamate. This triggers a slow-moving electrical wave, a calcium wave, that begins to spread outwards, moving from cell to cell through those tiny tunnels, the plasmodesmata. This wave carries the first local alert. Some of that signal then gets onto the highway system, the phloem, and travels rapidly throughout the rest of the plant. Within minutes, the roots have received the message. There's a caterpillar eating a leaf up there. The plant is now on high alert. It's not just a local response. It's a systemic one. The entire organism knows it is under attack and can begin to mount a coordinated defense. All of this is happening without a single neuron. It's a distributed, decentralized intelligence system. A quiet, slow, but incredibly sophisticated network of communication. The plant's response to injury is not just electrical. That electrical signal is just the first, fastest messenger. It's the fire alarm. But once the alarm has been sounded, a whole new level of communication begins. A chemical conversation, both within the plant and with the world outside. Let's go back to our caterpillar, munching on that leaf. The electrical wave has already been sent. Now, at the site of the wound, the plant begins to produce and release a cocktail of chemicals. Some of these are what we call volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. Volatile just means they evaporate easily. They become airborne. The most familiar example of this is the smell of freshly cut grass. That green, sharp scent you might enjoy on a summer day, That is the smell of a plant's silent scream. It's a massive release of VOCs, a chemical cry for help. These airborne signals are not for our benefit. They serve two main purposes. First, they are a warning to other parts of the same plant. A leaf downwind can smell the distress signal from a wounded leaf upwind and start preparing its own defenses before the attacker even gets there. Second, and even more amazingly, these signals are a warning to neighboring plants. A nearby tomato plant can detect the distress signals from a wounded sagebrush and will begin to ramp up its own defensive chemistry, even if it hasn't been attacked itself. Plants are eavesdropping on each other. There is a constant, invisible conversation happening in the air of any forest or field, a conversation of warnings and alerts. Some of these vakes do something else remarkable. They call in bodyguards. For example, when a tobacco plant is being eaten by a specific type of caterpillar, it releases a unique blend of VOCs. This chemical blend acts as a beacon for parasitic wasps. The wasps from a great distance can smell this specific help on being eaten by a hornworm. Signal. They fly in, find the caterpillar, and lay their eggs inside it. The wasp larvae then hatch and eat the caterpillar from the inside out, saving the plant. The plant, in its moment of distress, sends out a highly specific chemical message to summon the exact predator of its attacker. It's an incredible three-way ecological partnership, all orchestrated by the release of a specific scent. While this airborne conversation is happening, an intense chemical cascade is unfolding inside the plant's body. The initial electrical signal, that calcium wave we talked about, acts as a trigger for two major defense pathways. These are controlled by two key plant hormones, jasmonic acid and salicylic acid. You can think of them as the two top generals in the plant's defense army. Jasmonic acid is the general for physical warfare. It's typically activated by chewing insects and large wounds. Once the jasmonic acid pathway is turned on, the plant starts producing a whole host of defensive compounds. It might make its leaves taste bitter and disgusting. It might produce chemicals called protease inhibitors, which interfere with the insect's ability to digest the leaf protein, essentially starving it. It might even produce toxins that are directly poisonous to the insect. Salicylic acid, on the other hand, is the general for germ warfare. Its pathway is typically activated by pathogens like bacteria, fungi, and viruses. When salicylic acid is produced, it triggers a state in the plant called the systemic acquired resistance. The plant starts producing a range of antimicrobial proteins and fortifying its cell walls to make it harder for pathogens to invade. Interestingly, salicylic acid is very closely related to the active ingredient in aspirin. For centuries, people have used willow bark, which is rich in these compounds, as a pain reliever and fever reducer. It's a beautiful thought that the same molecule a plant uses to fight off its own infections can help us fight off ours. The sheer scale of the plant's chemical arsenal is breathtaking. The world of animal biochemistry is complex, but it is dwarfed by the chemical creativity of the plant kingdom. Scientists estimate that plants produce over 200,000 different types of secondary metabolites. These are the compounds that aren't essential for basic survival like photosynthesis, but are used for defense, communication, and interaction with the environment. They are the source of the flavors in our spices, the colors of our dyes, and the active ingredients in most of our medicines. And many of them are only synthesized when the plant is under attack. The plant has a vast chemical library, and when injured, it knows exactly which toxic or bitter book to pull off the shelf. This entire complex response, both airborne and internal, is coordinated by that initial signal. And in recent years, scientists have finally been able to watch it happen. In a landmark 2018 study, a team of researchers led by Masasugu Toyota managed to do something extraordinary. They genetically engineered an Arabidopsis plant, a small weed that is the lab rat of the plant world, so that its levels of calcium would glow. They used the same protein that makes jellyfish fluorescent. Now, whenever there was a high concentration of calcium ions in the plant, that part of the plant would emit a faint green light. Then they set up a camera and wounded one of the plant's leaves, either by cutting it with scissors or by letting a caterpillar munch on it. What they saw on the video was stunning. A wave of brilliant green light erupted from the wound site and began to spread throughout the entire plant. It flowed down the veins of the leaf into the stem and then branched out to all the other leaves and even down to the roots. They were watching, for the first time, the calcium wave, the plant's pain signal, as it traveled in real time. It was a visual confirmation of what Bose had detected with his instruments a century earlier. A silent, glowing message of distress, spreading at a speed of about 1 millimeter per second, putting the entire organism on high alert. The plant wasn't just a collection of individual parts. It was a single, integrated whole, responding to a threat in a beautifully coordinated way. The evidence for the complexity of these responses just keeps growing. It's not just a simple on-off switch. Plants seem to be able to distinguish between different kinds of trouble. For example, research has shown that a plant's response is different when a leaf is torn by the wind versus when it's being chewed by an insect. The caterpillar's saliva contains chemical cues that tell the plant, this is not random damage. This is a living threat. The plant then mounts a much more specific and aggressive defense than it would for a simple mechanical tear. They can even distinguish between different types of insects and tailor their chemical defenses accordingly. This is not the reaction of a simple machine. This is a highly sensitive and discerning organism. This sensitivity extends beyond threats. It extends to relationships. One of the most heartwarming areas of research is on plant kin recognition. Yes, plants seem to know who their family is. Suzanne Simard, a forest ecologist from Canada, has done groundbreaking work on this. She has shown that trees in a forest are connected by a vast underground network of fungi, which she calls the Wood Wide Web. Through this network, trees can share resources. A large, healthy mother tree can send carbon and nutrients to smaller, younger seedlings growing in its shade, helping them survive. And here's the amazing part. They preferentially send more resources to their own offspring, to their kin, than to unrelated seedlings. They can tell the difference. They do this by tasting the chemical signals released by the roots of their neighbors. It's a quiet, underground form of nepotism, a gentle favoritism that ensures the survival of their own lineage. This all points to a level of behavior that goes far beyond simple reflexes. Plants demonstrate what looks like anticipatory behavior. They have a strong internal clock, a circadian rhythm, just like we do. Many plants will ramp up their production of defensive chemicals just before dawn. Why? Because that's when many insects and other herbivores are most active. They are not waiting to be attacked. They are preparing for the attack they've learned to expect at a certain time of day. They are using past experience, encoded in their rhythms, to anticipate a future threat. All of this evidence, the specific responses to different threats, the recognition of kin, the anticipation of danger, paints a picture of an organism that is far more dynamic and aware of its world than we ever imagined. It's an awareness that operates on a different timescale with a different set of tools. But it is a form of awareness nonetheless. A slow, green, chemical, and electrical awareness. And it leaves us with a question that feels both scientific and deeply philosophical. What is all this activity for if not to, in some way, feel the world? Now we come to one of the most provocative and mind-bending chapters in our story, the anesthesia experiments. Anesthetics are a class of chemicals that cause a temporary loss of sensation and consciousness. We use them in surgery to ensure that a patient feels no pain and has no awareness of the procedure. For a long time, we thought their effects were unique to animals, to organisms with a central nervous system. But what if they weren't? In 2017, this question was put to the test in a series of elegant experiments. Scientists in Europe and Japan independently decided to see what would happen if they exposed sensitive plants to general anesthetics. They placed a Venus flytrap, that famous carnivorous plant, in a glass chamber and piped in diethyl ether, a common anesthetic. Then they touched the trigger hairs on its leafy trap. Normally, this would cause the trap to snap shut in less than a second. But under the influence of the ether, the plant was completely unresponsive. The trap remained wide open, no matter how many times the hairs were touched. The plant had been, for all intents and purposes, put to sleep. They tried the same thing with our friend, the Mimosa pudica. They exposed it to the anesthetic, and then they touched its delicate leaves. Nothing happened. The shy plant was no longer shy. The leaves remained open and outstretched. Its famous folding response was completely gone. What was happening? The scientists hooked the plants up to electrodes to find out. They discovered that under anesthesia, the plant's ability to generate and transmit action potentials was completely shut down. The electrical signals we talked about, the waves of charge that carry the message to move, were silenced. The ether was preventing the ion channels in the plant cell membranes from opening and closing properly. The go signal could no longer be sent. When the anesthetic wore off, the plant's electrical activity returned, and their ability to move was restored. The Venus flytrap could snap shut again. The mimosa could fold its leaves again. This is a stunning parallel. The very same chemicals that block electrical signaling in our brains and prevent us from feeling pain or having a conscious experience also block electrical signaling in plants and prevent them from responding to their environment. It turns out that some of the same ion channels that are affected by anesthetics in our neurons exist in plants as well. These molecular structures have been conserved across more than 1 billion years of evolution. The off switch for responsiveness in an animal and the off switch for responsiveness in a plant appear to be remarkably similar. These findings throw a fascinating wrench into the debate. They raise a profound philosophical question. We define consciousness in animals partly by its absence, that is, by the ability of anesthetics to reversibly switch it off. If the same chemicals, likely acting on similar molecular targets, can switch off a plant's responsiveness, what does that imply about the state that is being switched off? Of course, no one is arguing that a Venus flytrap is having complex thoughts or a subjective experience of surgery. But the experiments force us to confront the possibility that consciousness might not be an all-or-nothing phenomenon. Perhaps it's a spectrum. Perhaps what anesthetics are really doing is shutting down a fundamental property of life, the ability of a system to integrate information and act on it. In animals, with our complex brains, This property manifests as what we call consciousness. In plants, with their decentralized networks, it manifests as the ability to snap a trap shut or fold a leaf. The anesthesia experiments don't prove that plants feel pain, but they do show that the biological machinery for responsiveness in plants and animals shares a deep and ancient heritage. They blur the lines. They make our neat and tidy categories of sentient and non-sentient feel a little less certain. They invite a sense of wonder and humility. They suggest that the mystery of consciousness might be woven into the very fabric of life itself, in ways we are only just beginning to understand. The sleeping plant, under the influence of ether, holds a quiet mirror up to our own sleeping, anesthetized brains and asks, are we really so different? It is now time for us to be responsible scientific storytellers. We have explored the tantalizing evidence that suggests a complex inner life for plants. We've seen them learn, remember, communicate, and react in sophisticated ways. We've even seen them be put to sleep by the same chemicals we use. It's easy to get swept away by these romantic and exciting ideas. But science demands balance, and the vast majority of mainstream scientists would offer a firm but gentle hold on. They would argue that while all of this is fascinating, calling it pain or consciousness is a bridge too far. And their arguments are very strong. The primary argument against plant pain is a simple one, based in biology. Plants lack the necessary hardware. In animals, the experience of pain is not just a simple reflex. It is a complex, subjective, emotional experience. It requires a brain. Specifically, it requires a central nervous system that can process signals, interpret them as threatening, and generate the unpleasant emotional state we call suffering. Pain is not just the signal. It's the interpretation of the signal. To feel pain as we know it, you need specialized nerve endings called nociceptors. These are the receptors that detect noxious stimuli, intense heat, pressure, or damaging chemicals. When a nociceptor is activated, it sends an urgent electrical signal up the spinal cord to the brain. In the brain, this signal is processed in multiple areas, including the thalamus, the somatosensory cortex, and the limbic system. It's this complex processing that creates the full experience of pain, the location, the intensity, and the awful, unpleasant emotional component. Plants have none of this. They have no nociceptors. They have no nerves, no spinal cord, and most importantly, no brain. While they can detect damage and send electrical and chemical signals in response, there is no central processor to turn that signal into a subjective experience. The argument is that what we are seeing in plants is more akin to a sophisticated alarm system than a feeling. When you pull a fire alarm, bells ring, sprinklers go off, and emergency doors may unlock. It's a complex, coordinated response to a stimulus. But no one would argue that the building itself feels the fire. It is simply executing a pre-programmed set of instructions. Most scientists argue that plants are doing the same thing, just with biology instead of wires. The second major argument is an evolutionary one. Why would an organism evolve the capacity to feel pain? Pain is incredibly useful for mobile creatures. If you touch a hot stove, the intense pain makes you pull your hand back instantly, preventing further damage. The memory of that pain teaches you not to touch the stove again. Pain drives behavior that promotes survival. It tells you to rest an injured leg, to avoid a predator, to seek shelter. Now consider a plant. A plant is sessile. It is rooted to the spot. It cannot run away from a caterpillar. It cannot move into the shade to avoid a scorching sun. It cannot pull its roots out of dry soil. From an evolutionary perspective, what benefit would there be for a plant to experience suffering? If it is being eaten, it must simply endure it. To evolve the complex machinery for a negative subjective experience that it can do nothing to escape from would be, from a purely functional standpoint, a cruel and pointless evolutionary dead end. It would be a massive waste of energy with no corresponding survival benefit. The plant's complex chemical and electrical responses are its way of doing something about the damage, mounting a defense, warning its neighbors. That is the useful adaptation. The internal feeling of suffering is not. Finally, there is the argument of determinism. The proponents of plant consciousness point to their complex behaviors as evidence of intelligence. But critics would argue that this complexity can still be explained through purely mechanistic, biochemical pathways. They see the plant not as a conscious agent, but as an incredibly sophisticated organic robot. Its behavior is deterministic. If you provide stimulus A, you will always get response B because a specific chemical pathway has been triggered. The learning shown by the mimosa plant can be explained by epigenetic changes, not by a conscious decision to ignore a stimulus. The kin recognition can be explained by chemical receptors on the roots that bind to specific molecules released by relatives. Every seemingly intelligent behavior, the argument goes, can be broken down and explained by a chain of cause and effect at the molecular level. There is no need to invoke a mysterious unobservable property like consciousness or feeling to explain what we see. The scientific principle of Occam's razor states that the simplest explanation is usually the best one. And the simplest explanation here is that plants are complex, responsive biological machines, not sentient beings. The scientific consensus, therefore, remains firm. Electrical signaling does not equate to subjective experience. Complex responses do not equate to consciousness. And damage detection does not equate to pain. It is a position of caution, of rigor, and of a deep respect for the high bar that must be cleared before we can attribute something as profound as sentience to another form of life. It's not a dismissal of the plant's incredible abilities, but rather a precise use of language, an insistence that words like pain and consciousness have very specific meanings that plants simply do not meet. This brings us to the heart of the scientific storm, the backlash, the debate. When those scientists in 2006 proposed the term plant neurobiology, they knew it would be controversial. But the intensity of the reaction highlights a deep division in how we ought to talk about the green world. Let's go back to that 2007 letter signed by 36 respected plant scientists. Their objection was not really about the science itself. No one was denying that plants have electrical signals or complex communication systems. Their objection was about the word, neurobiology. They argued that using a term so closely associated with the animal brain was fundamentally misleading. It tricks the public, and even other scientists, into thinking that plants have something like a brain, which they do not. It's a form of anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is a wonderful human tendency. It's our inclination to attribute human traits, emotions, and intentions to non-human entities. We do it all the time. We say our car is stubborn when it won't start. We say our computer is thinking when it's slow. We talk to our pets as if they understand every word. It's a natural way for us to relate to the world. But in science, it can be a dangerous trap. It can lead to misinterpretation of data and a loss of objectivity. The critics of plant neurobiology argued that using such a loaded term was bad scientific practice. It prioritizes a catchy, provocative metaphor over precise, accurate description. It opens the door to the kind of pseudoscience that surrounded Cleve Baxter's work and undermines the hard-won credibility of plant biology as a serious, rigorous field. They suggested a different, more neutral term: plant signaling and behavior. This term, they argued, accurately describes the field of study without making any unsubstantiated claims about brain-like functions. On the other side of the debate are the proponents of the new perspective. Scientists like Stefano Mancuso, one of the founders of the plant neurobiology field, and Monica Gagliano. They counter that the critics are missing the point. They argue that refusing to use terms like intelligence, learning, and memory just because plants don't have a brain is a form of neurochauvinism. It's an assumption that our way of doing things, the animal way, is the only way. They argue that these terms should be defined by their function, not by their physical substrate. If an organism can process information from its environment, learn from experience, and make adaptive choices, then that is a form of intelligence, whether it is accomplished by a centralized brain or a decentralized network of cells. If an organism can store information from a past event and use it to modify its future behavior, that is a form of memory, regardless of where or how that information is stored. They use the term neurobiology not to say plants have neurons, but to signal that they are studying the same kinds of questions that neurobiologists study: how organisms process information. They believe that sticking to old, restrictive definitions holds the science back. It prevents us from asking the most interesting questions. This debate is more than just a squabble over words. It reflects a deeper philosophical tension in science. On one side, you have the reductionists, who believe that all complex phenomena can and should be broken down into their simplest component parts. For them, a plant is a collection of cells, hormones, and electrical pathways, and its behavior is the sum of these parts. On the other side, you have the holists, who argue that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. They believe that complex systems, like a plant, can have emergent properties, like intelligence or learning, that cannot be fully understood just by looking at the individual components. It's a debate between caution and provocation, between precision and poetry. The critics fear that anthropomorphizing plants will confuse the public and damage science. The proponents believe that a little bit of anthropomorphism can be a powerful tool, helping us to see the world from a new perspective and to recognize intelligence in forms we had previously overlooked. It's a polite but passionate disagreement, happening in the quiet pages of scientific journals and at academic conferences. It shows that science is not a monolithic block of facts, but a living, breathing process of argument and discovery. A conversation that is constantly evolving, just like the organisms it seeks to understand. As we drift deeper into the night, let our thoughts become a little more fluid. Let's move beyond the laboratory and the scientific journals and into the realm of philosophy. What if plants do have some form of experience? What would that mean for us? This is where the questions become both bigger and more personal. The entire foundation of Western ethics is built on a hierarchy of being. At the top, we have humans, with our reason and consciousness. Below us are animals, which we grant some moral consideration based on their ability to feel pain, their sentience. This is why most people would agree that it's wrong to kick a dog, but perfectly fine to kick a stone. The dog is sentient. The stone is not. And plants, in this traditional view, have always been firmly in the stone category. They are things, resources, objects for us to use. But if the work of scientists like Gagliano and Mancuso is right, if plants possess even a rudimentary form of learning, memory, and awareness, then this neat and tidy hierarchy begins to crumble. It challenges the ethical frameworks that guide our behavior. If a plant can sense and respond to injury in a sophisticated way, does that change our moral obligations towards it? This is not a comfortable question. It directly impacts our most basic activities, from gardening to farming to what we put on our dinner plate. For many, vegetarianism or veganism is an ethical choice based on avoiding harm to sentient animals. But if plants also have a claim to sentience, however different from our own, then where do we draw the line? The philosophy of fruitarianism, where one only eats the fruits and seeds of a plant without harming the parent organism, suddenly seems less eccentric. We must tread carefully here. The goal is not to induce anxiety or guilt. It is simply to engage in a thought experiment. It forces us to think more deeply about what harm means. Perhaps the harm is not in the act of eating, which is a necessary part of life's cycle, but in the manner of our interaction. Perhaps it suggests a need for a different kind of agriculture, one that is more attentive to the well-being of the crops, that minimizes stress and treats the plants not as inert machines, but as living partners in the process of cultivation. This debate about plant consciousness doesn't exist in a vacuum. It intersects beautifully with another profound modern conversation, the one about artificial intelligence. We are building machines that can learn, that can process information, that can beat us at our most complex games. And we are grappling with the question, when does an A cross the line from being a very clever simulation to being genuinely conscious? How would we even know? The criteria we are trying to develop to assess AI consciousness, information integration, flexible responses, goal-directed behavior are eerily similar to the criteria being used to investigate plant intelligence. Both debates force us to stop defining consciousness as what humans have, and to start thinking about it as a more abstract property of complex information processing systems. A plant and a supercomputer are very different, but the philosophical questions they raise are sisters. This line of thinking can lead us to a very old and very beautiful philosophical idea, panpsychism. Panpsychism is the view that consciousness is not a special, rare property that only emerged in complex brains. Instead, it is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the universe. Just as matter has properties like mass and charge, panpsychism suggests it also has a property of experience or proto-consciousness. Everything, from an electron to a rock to a star, has a tiny, vanishingly simple flicker of inner life. In this view, the complex consciousness of a human brain is not something new that was created from nothing. It is an incredibly complex and sophisticated arrangement of these tiny, fundamental bits of experience. If you are a panpsychist, the question is not, do plants have consciousness? But rather, how complex and unified is the consciousness of a plant? A plant's experience would be vastly different from ours. It would be slow, diffuse, and likely have very little sense of self. It might be more like a continuous dreamlike state of sensing light, water, and chemical gradients. It's a radical idea, but it's also a deeply unifying one. It erases the hard line between the living and the non-living, the sentient and the non-sentient. It paints a picture of a universe that is awake and experiencing itself at every level. in countless different ways. It's a profoundly peaceful and interconnected worldview, a thought to hold on to as you drift. Ultimately, the scandalous idea of the feeling plant pushes us to a place of greater humility. It asks us to reconsider our place in the world. For so long, we have seen ourselves as the sole proprietors of thought, feeling, and intelligence. We have viewed the rest of nature as a backdrop for our human drama. But perhaps we are not the only ones thinking. Perhaps the world is filled with different kinds of minds, different kinds of awareness. A slow, green mind in the forest, a distributed, networked mind in the fungal mats beneath our feet, a fast, electrical mind inside our own skulls. The implications are not about creating a new set of rules to live by. They are about cultivating a new sense of reverence, of wonder, and of kinship with the astonishingly complex and mysterious world of which we are just one small, fleeting part. As our journey comes to a close, let's look forward. Where is this quiet green revolution heading? The questions that were once whispered in the gardens of Darwin or demonstrated to skeptical audiences by those are now at the forefront of cutting-edge research. Scientists today are not just asking if plants communicate. They are trying to map the entire conversation. One of the most exciting frontiers is the attempt to create a plant connectome. In neuroscience, a connectome is a complete map of all the neural connections in a brain. It's the brain's wiring diagram. Plant scientists are now trying to do the same for plants. They are working to map the vast network of vascular bundles and plasmosmata, the highways and secret tunnels that carry electrical and chemical signals throughout the plant body. They want to understand the plant's information architecture. By mapping this network, they hope to understand how a plant integrates information from different sources. How does a signal from a wounded leaf combine with a signal from a dry root and information about the time of day to produce a single, coherent response? This question of information integration is key. One of the leading scientific theories of consciousness, the Integrated Information Theory, or IIT, proposes that consciousness is a measure of a system's ability to integrate information. A system is conscious, the theory says, if it is a single, integrated whole that cannot be broken down into independent parts, and if it has a large repertoire of possible states. Scientists are now trying to apply this mathematical framework to plants. Can we measure the integrated information of a plant's signaling network? Does it meet the criteria for a minimal form of consciousness, according to this theory? The research is in its infancy, but it represents a bold attempt to move the question of plant consciousness from the realm of philosophy into the realm of testable, quantitative science. Another key area of research focuses on flexibility. The biggest criticism of plant intelligence is that their responses are pre-programmed and deterministic. But are they always? Researchers are designing clever experiments to test if plants can show flexible, goal-directed behavior that goes beyond a simple, hardwired script. Can a plant, faced with a novel problem it has never encountered in its evolutionary history, come up with a novel solution? Can it weigh different options and choose the best one? For example, if a climbing pea plant is presented with two potential supports of different quality, can it assess them both before choosing which one to grow towards? Some initial studies suggest that they can, showing a pause in growth that looks tantalizingly like a moment of deliberation. And finally, the research continues to explore the deep evolutionary continuities between us and the green world. We are sequencing the genomes of ancient plants and comparing their genes for signaling and response with our own. We keep finding these incredible overlaps, like the glutamate receptors and the ion channels affected by anesthesia. It seems that the basic toolkit for sensing and responding to the world is incredibly ancient. Life on Earth discovered a set of molecular tricks that worked very well, and it has been using and adapting them ever since. The evolutionary tree of life, which split into the animal and plant kingdoms over 1.5 billion years ago, still has common roots. We are distant cousins, but we may still be speaking a few words of the same ancient biological language. So, what is the answer? Does the plant feel pain? After our long journey, you can see that there is no simple yes or no. If by pain you mean the conscious, emotional experience of suffering that you or I would feel, then the answer, according to mainstream science, is almost certainly no. But if you are asking a deeper question, if you are asking whether a plant can sense damage, whether it can engage in complex, intelligent behavior to protect itself, whether it possesses a form of awareness that is unique to its own mode of being, then the answer seems to be a resounding and fascinating yes. The beauty of this story lies not in a final answer, but in the mystery itself. It lies in the way it gently challenges our most basic assumptions. It encourages us to look at the humble houseplant on our windowsill, the tree outside our window, or the grass beneath our feet with a new sense of wonder. These are not passive, silent decorations. They are active, dynamic beings, engaged in a constant, complex conversation with their world. They are learning, remembering, and defending themselves in ways that we are only just beginning to appreciate. So as you settle into your final moments before sleep, carry that thought with you. The world is more alive, more aware, and more mysterious than we can ever fully know. The quiet plant in the corner is a gateway to some of the deepest questions we can ask about life, consciousness, and our place in the universe. And sometimes the most profound truths are not shouted from the rooftops, but whispered on the slow, green, electrical currents of a leaf. Close your eyes and listen. You might just be able to hear them. Sleep well.